Hello, and welcome back to We're Not So Different, a podcast about how we inconvenience our significant others in various ways by doing this. My name is Luke Waters, and I am an amateur historian. And as always, I'm joined by Dr. Eleanor Yaniga, who is anything but. Today we're doing more nationalism in the Middle Ages ? Stuff. But before we get there, we got a question from one of our patrons, Hipster Wizard, who says, since demonology was a pretty big deal in medieval societies, both for religious doctrine and its practical applications in exorcism, I was wondering how/when angelology and the classification of angels became a thing. The 9 choirs of Pseudo-Dionysius are the most well-known, but how many competing/evolving views existed in the medieval period, and how did religious authorities treat these classifications?
Okay, I love this question, and I'm going to say that my understanding of this, it comes from a very good book that you very well might be interested in reading if this is your thing. It is by Meredith Gill, and it is called Angels and the Order of Heaven in Medieval and Renaissance Italy. And you kind of hit the big one already, which is Pseudo-Dionysius. And for those who are not in the know, your man there... he's a 6th century Neoplatonist, and he is kind of like writing from the 5th to early 6th century, and he's mostly attempting to transpose pagan Neoplatonism into kind of like the Christian cosmos, right? So he's just trying to say, well, here's how we make Platonic thought make sense within a Christian way of thinking. So he
stealing from the pagans, just like Saturnalia, you bastard.
Basically,
I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Basically, so like especially he does like some Plancius, but also like Proclus is the big one. So a lot of Proclus and a lot of Platonic Academy stuff, which is all like Athenian. And so he's like, okay, I'm going to do all this all in kind of Christian context. And the thing is, the major reason he's who you've heard of is like, yep. That's the one, and this is, has to do with how medieval Christians think more generally, right? So when they are doing, for example, any kind of academic study, they're always going for the standing on the shoulders of giants thing. They're not going for the, I am going to make a brand new, bold, like agential cut, and... That's gonna really annoy Justin. He keeps saying that I keep stealing his shit and saying it on the podcast, but I'm doing it again.
I'm sorry. Could you say that again?
An agential cut
and agential cut.
Yeah, I think that I'm using this right.
No. I'm sorry. I thought you were saying the word "quote unquote" cunt.
No.
And so I was terribly confused.
Yeah.
I myself am not using that word. I'm using quote because I am a good person or whatever.
That is good.
Sorry, I was like, you said it again, and I was like, she has to be saying cut, but I really got to be sure because every once in a while you just be like, well, okay, yeah,
okay, yeah. So an agential cut is like it's a what that is it's a Deleuze-Guattarian concept, which refers to an object or being that aren't really necessarily like separated or objectified or like bordered within time space. So it's like there is like they essentially enact something that's both inside and outside of a phenomena as a single movement. So like what I'm saying is that like you can't really have a medieval person who's doing that because they're not attempting to even slightly be outside of their phenomena or their milieu. So if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I should.
Yeah, it does.
I need to calm my shit down. But anyway.
No. I really appreciate your explanation.
That's a good one. Dude, I'm such like.
I can follow a lot of stuff, but like when you start talking about,
I'm gonna start calling people agential cunts though. When they're like, This is my new one. Like, I'll be like,
Deleuzian takedown ever.
It's gonna be like someone who tries to like skip the queue at the pub, right? Because they're trying to be in the pub, but like not partaking. I don't know. Like I'm gonna get in trouble for all this later and be told that I don't understand it, and that's probably true. But like getting back to pseudo Dionysus, like the point is, because no one wants to like remake the wheel, right, in the medieval period, because that would almost make you look like an idiot. The point is everybody wants to build on it. And so a lot of people do build on this. And for those who don't know, Pseudo-Dionysius is the one who's come up with the 9 orders of angelic hierarchy. And these go from like the seraphim, cherubim, the thrones, the dominations, the powers, the virtues, the principalities, the archangels, and then the angels. Right? So there's like it is like a very kind of late antique / early medieval way of thinking where it's like, oh yeah, there's definitely like a hierarchy and it goes like this. And like, here's all these little guys that have like different powers over certain things. And the way that medieval people then kind of take this and run with it is by also doing like biblical exegesis. So kind of like looking at biblical references to angels as well. And so basically from a theological standpoint, how they talk about angels is that they are incorporeal, they're agender, but like in some of them, like of the biblical books, like so for example, the story of Abraham and the 3 angels in Genesis 18, or also in like the book of Tobit, the angels can take a human form, and they can be mistaken most specifically for men. Right. So, for example, in the Sodom and Gomorrah story, the angels look like a couple of sexy dudes. So, in like, there's some kind of things like, so for example, in Isaiah, but also Ezekiel, you can basically have a description of the Ark of the Covenant, which has like angels, like especially seraphim and cherubim, which appear at its wings. And then, of course, you've got the art with, like, the winged angels everywhere. And these are usually developed from textual sources. So, right, like, the wings kind of show not only the idea of angels as messengers between heaven and earth, right? So the flying is showing how quickly they can move things back and forth. But it's also based on these kind of stories. So they also kind of have a little bit of rooting there in they're, like, kind of adapted from some pagan images. Like, so, for example, Nike. Or winged victory, right? And so this then gets run with, so especially our boy Tommy Quine, but also like Dante uses these same kind of hierarchies, but also other philosophers like Matteo Palmieri and Pico della Mirandola. Like these your man there. Right? Like, they are all the ones who kind of, like, continue to philosophize and theosophize about all of this. But they don't really try to break the wheel. So, yeah, the main reason why you've heard of Pseudo-Dionysius doing this is because he's, like, the best to ever do it, right? And everybody loves him, and they don't want to make something else. They just want to have their own take on it. But, yeah, I do really recommend The Gill on this if you want to know more. But yeah, angels, weird little guys.
Where do the angels with 70 eyes and inner moving parts from the from the random Old Testament stuff? Where do they fit in?
Yeah,
which hierarchy are they?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of the times those are often like seraphim and stuff like that, because those are they're the ones who are be not afraid in your ass.
Yeah.
And when they're being not afraid in your ass, it's usually because they got to make some kind of announcement, right? Yeah,
I just needed to know like that my boys weren't being left out, because I feel like a lot of people, they're like, oh, like those angels are mentioned a couple times in the Bible, but like it's mostly like human forms or whatever, and I'm like, I don't really give a shit, man. You got like a Rubik's cube appearing in the sky with different eyes on every square, and it like, of course, people are gonna think that's cool. What the fuck are you talking?
Yeah, it's like I like how they're kind of like H.P. Lovecrafting angels, where it's like they're eldritch horrors beyond your comprehension.
Yeah.
So
here, in the Bible, the eldritch horrors beyond your comprehension look like weird Rube Goldberg devices that move on their own, and with H.P. Lovecraft, it's just always like a weird cuttlefish.
So it's always a cuttlefish. Yeah. That fucking guy hates cuttlefish. So.
Like, man, they're just normal fish. What the fuck is your problem?
He's
what
just
did they
a little
ever
guy.
do?
He's just a guy. Yeah. Much like angels. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Hipster Wizard, thank you for the question. We will actually have another question later in the episode. But yeah, if you want to ask us questions like these, please subscribe to the Patreon, patreon.com/WNSDpod, $5 a month. You get the bonus episodes. You get like the one we've got coming up this week, a little current events thing, and then you get these episodes ad-free, access to the Discord, ask us questions, all that sort of stuff. Yeah. So yeah, on to the main episode. So today we're once again talking about, I guess, what we'll call proto-nationalism in the Middle Ages. That is to say, the fact that nationalism as we conceive of it in the modern era did not and could not exist in the same form in the Middle Ages, but the roots of our nationalism stem directly from both historical events from the medieval era and bad historiography written about the era starting in the 19th century. And I know I have a tendency to write long sentences sometimes, but goddamn.
That makes sense, though.
Admittedly, the whole sequence is a lot to unpack, and it has 3 parts, some of which we've talked about before. Last week specifically, we discussed 2 of the parts, some of those medieval roots of modern nationalism, such as pogroms against the Jews, religiously motivated imperialist crusades, early forms of racism, etc., and the bad 19th century historiography. But something we haven't really drilled down on too much are the fundamental material reasons why nationalism couldn't be a thing in the Middle Ages. And it's mostly for 2 reasons that they couldn't help. Namely, there just aren't that many other people around, and their political forms had not sufficiently advanced, meaning that borders were still relatively fluid, and governance was almost always based on dynastic rule of monarchies and empires and marriage alliances, etc. It was, and I want everyone to get excited for a big historiographical buzzword here, a time of pre-Westphalian sovereignty.
Woo!
Anyway, woo, yeah. All right. Parenthetically, the point may seem rudimentary, but just think about the fact that by the end of the Black Death, only an estimated 370 million people were alive, which is just 4.5% of the current 8 million-ish people living in 2024. Just imagine if there were 95% fewer people living in your city or town or village right now. Not that they died, just there were 95% less of them. To give but one example, the population of London would drop from roughly 8.9 million people to a shade under 450,000. However, since the planet itself hasn't changed size in the intervening centuries, that just means that humans were far less densely packed on it, leading to a whole host of radically altered material circumstances. Fewer people means less need for housing, less settlement generally, which caused an absence of population pressure for polities to always seek to spread to the maximal territorial extent possible. Further, in cases where borders were fixed and even hotly contested at the time, they could change hands from one ruler to another at any given moment due to systems of dynastic marriage and manorial customs at the time. That meant that in the span of 30 years, for example, the rulership of your little French cottage could change hands 5 times by going from the French crown to the English crown as part of a treaty ending a war, then to the Burgundians as local liege lords of the English crown, then the Burgundians proper after the English lose the war, before being passed on to a cadet branch of the Burgundians via marriage dowry, and finally back to the French after a round of political consolidation. And all that is before you even get to everyone's favorite in real life Crusader Kings save file, the Holy Roman Empire.
Woo!
So today we're going to take a more materialist look at how malleable borders and fluid dynastic rulership combined to prevent modern nationalism from forming in the Middle Ages. And maybe we'll discuss why this model doesn't really work for medieval China, even if they still didn't achieve the nationalism during that era. So, Eleanor, let's start with the borders. Most of us are quite familiar with modern national borders. For most of us, they are fixed entities that are almost always heavily policed and constantly monitored with checkpoints to choke ingress and egress from the country. How different were medieval borders compared to this?
Yeah, hugely, because they're more of a vibe. It's just like that's it.
Like we put it on a map, but
yeah. And it's like, you can kind of put it on a map, but sort of like, they're like, homies aren't even like, yeah, I got a map. I'm like, where'd you get a map? Is that,
yeah. What is it a map of?
What's
Like,
it a
how
map of?
accurate
Is
is
Jerusalem
this
in
map?
the middle of it?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
where are the dog-headed people? You know,
yeah.
like what does that mean? You know, so basically, the thing about borders is borders are a political ideal, right? And
Right.
they have the meaning that the systems which idealize them intend, right? So for medieval people, borders are really more about customarial duties or, whatever family is kind of controlling things in theory. They're just in the same way that you don't have as many people who are kind of like pushing all the time to go out to borders, you don't have as many people to fucking control them. Like,
Right.
it's hard enough to control a border now, in the year of our Lord 2K24. It's very, very difficult to do this in 1218 for similar reasons. It's just they're too vast. There's absolutely no way that you can be looking at all these things all the time. And a lot of times these borders then also overlap because, as you were saying, you can have a liege lord within Burgundy, and then sometimes they are a French subject or a English one, and so this is going to go back and forth. So you have all these competing things all over on top of you, and then within that, again, there'll be district boundaries for, say, what parish you're in. Or like maybe the church is the one who owns the land that you live on, but that particular area that is controlled by the church is then within the demesne of another lord. So there's always going to be these kind of competing jurisdictions and generalities about various places. And they are much more comfortable with this. In a medieval mindset. They're not asking for rigidities, and they're not saying that there has to be a very specific line where on this side it means one side and on that side it means another thing. For them, borders can and do mean several different things at the same time.
Right. Right. So, like, what, let's say we're back in, medieval times and we're driving our cart from, one township or village to another to trade something. What would we expect to see at a heavily trafficked medieval border crossing? Heavily trafficked being, for the time, obviously.
Yeah, so if it's heavily trafficked, you are going to see probably some markers that say you're crossing a border. So a lot of time this might be blazes on trees, so people just like paint on a tree something.
Okay.
Or, you might paint something on a boulder that's nearby. You might actually dig a ditch or have like correspondingly, you might have big mounds of earth that show that you're crossing along somewhere. Or you might even have like actual signs in some cases.
Yeah.
Now, the actual sign would probably have a picture or something. It's not going to have like words, so you might have something that's got like heraldry on it, or just, or even sometimes just like a post, like just be like, yep, so y'all know what this means, like just so that people know that you are kind of passing by somewhere. There's no real kind of like comprehensive system of control posts or guard patrols. That's not going to be like a thing. You're not going to see like guys marching up and down necessarily. The one time that this is going to not be true is if that heavily trafficked border crossing is also at a pinch point where people think that they can collect tolls.
Okay.
So you're more likely to have guys who are standing around if you're on a mountain pass, or if this is like the easiest part of a river to get across. Is there a bridge? Is there a ferry? Is it just like everywhere else is really, maybe it's just a ford that's easy to get across, right? And even then, it's when we say guards, it's not necessarily like knights. You probably just have like local guys who this is their job.
Right.
And they take the tolls, right? So that would kind of be what you would expect to see. Now, in places where you have more contestation of land, so for example, if you're going into Burgundian territory, you very well may have stuff like suddenly a lot of big castles. Or maybe some smaller camps of soldiers and that kind of thing that are around the joint that you kind of like put out there to make a point. And this is certainly kind of like the case, for example, the reason why there are more castles in Wales than almost anywhere else in Europe to this day is because the Welsh are like these fucking English. You know, right? And so they're, they've got castles all along the border because they're just like these fucking guys any minute now with the,
They're coming. Yep.
yeah. And so, and that's what castles do a lot of the time. Castles themselves are a marker of the fact that you're going into another territory.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So like they obviously had them listed on maps, and some, as you said, might set out boundary markers or stones or, draw it on trees or whatever. But like, really, how static were these borders? Because our borders don't usually change unless there's like a big geopolitical thing or, a country wants to do some more colonialism. But like, they don't usually change that often.
Yeah. So, spoiler, in the medieval period, they do. So, like, and I guess here what we have to say is that kind of like there's a sort of difference between political borders or even natural borders and cultural borders. And that's kind of like one of the big things where it's like culture is kind of like what people use to decide like what if they're a part of something or not, right? And like even like natural borders themselves aren't going to overlap with what people think is somewhere. So there are big exceptions to this, though, like the Rhine. Is one of these exceptions. So it's like the Rhine is like a cultural border and like had been basically from the Roman period, right? Like that's kind of like where everyone went like, yep, okay, this is different, right? The Alps or the Pyrenees usually also kind of denote a particular natural border. So it's like, you're either in kind of like the German lands or you're in the Italian lands when you got, or the French ones with the Alps. Pyrenees, same thing. It's like, are you coming under like the Spanish auspices or are you coming under like Frenchified ones?
Right.
But like they also kind of then constitute their own cultural areas as a result. So like there's Pyrenean culture, there's like a culture in the Alps, right? That's how you get Swiss people, right? So you get these kind of like cultures that will be defined by the kind of like border-like nature that they have, right? So there is no like one way to be Swiss, as we've talked about repeatedly. It's like you might be all kinds of wild things, but the thing that kind of makes them come together is the fact that they exist in this context, which is very, very specifically regional and border based, right? And then there's also kind of like seas, right? So like, the Strait of Dover, right? It's like, so this is what makes England and not just like French when the Normans take over. Is like there's a fucking sea here, right?
Yeah.
So obviously it's kind of different. So and similarly, like the Baltic Sea, that's a really big one in terms of defining borders, or even the North Seas. So these are like what makes something Ireland as opposed to Britain. What makes this like Scandinavian or not, right? But then even having said that, there are cultural borders within Scandinavia that exist. So, for example, Finns are not Scandinavian, right? They're up there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they've got a linguistic barrier and a cultural barrier and border, which makes them different, right? So the thing that's interesting about this is like even the things that we would think are obvious lines, so like mountains or seas or rivers, they don't necessarily mean anything inevitable. And I think this is one of the really interesting things about the difference between the medieval way of thinking about culture or nationality is that we tend to think of nationality or borders as inevitable, right? And like this is the logical way of doing things. But for medieval people, that simply isn't the case, and that's not how things work. I mean, instead, you have a bigger reliance on customary things.
Yeah.
So what they will say is like, oh, well, what's the customary law that you use here? What are the customary borders? What are just like the straight up customs in one place or another? And what is it that makes you different? So here, linguistic boundaries matter rather a lot, like as we see in the case of our friends, the Finns. What you eating over there? That's important. Like, again, who's your parish? Who's your bishop? Like that's a big one, right? And so these kind of things have a kind of meaning over and on top of, like some nebulous idea of Frenchness, for example.
Yeah. So yeah, I think we pretty much got the idea. These borders were, for the most part, kind of arbitrary lines drawn on maps that weren't terribly enforceable, except that maybe your pinch points or stuff like that. But yeah, it's just they didn't. The borders they weren't the same, like they just weren't the same. We have like very defined ones, and that started after Westphalia, and then it especially started when the victorious allies after World War I and World War II carved up everything based on feeling, idiocy,
Yeah.
paternalistic
wars down the line.
imperial bullshit. Yeah. But yeah, like just think about the HRE. Think of any picture you've seen of the boundaries within the Holy Roman Empire, and think about like how often we talk about, they change hands, somebody's kid, because Germany has their own weird inheritance stuff. Somebody's kid gets it, and then all of a sudden you got two duchies, and one of them is a voting or an electoral one, and the other one is just a place with a city in it. And you're just like, well, there you go.
Yeah, you're bang on here, Luke. And like this is the thing, is that like technically in like Italy or the Holy Roman Empire, they are not enforceable.
Yeah.
Like, how would you? And, like, to the point where people were like, well, what the fuck does that mean if you ask to do it? And it's like, this is an interesting thing. And it's why, that people showing the map of the Holy Roman Empire and going, oh, you see, this is why it was inevitable that it's like, shut up.
The only thing inevitable from that map is that no one is going to be able to rule that entire land area by themselves.
Exactly.
That's it. The
That's
rest of it is just a shit show. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And it's like, so there is what we got to understand when we see like the 518 or so different polities on that map, is that they mean real different things, right? So it's like sometimes it means, well, here it's kind of like, I don't know, the city. They're doing their thing, and the city doesn't care, because the city doesn't care about like the land that they own around the city, right? The way that the city controls their border is that they will, for example, have a wall, right? And if you want to come into the city, then you've got to go into the gate, and then when you go into the gate, they will either shoot at you if you're attacking, or if you're bringing in goods, they'll inspect your carts, and then they will take their tolls, right? So that's how the city controls their border. But they're not controlling like the fucking fields 15 miles down the road that technically they own, right? They don't care about that. And like for, say, the rich people, like the nobles who they have borders to things, they're not really intending to control it. What they're saying is that's like, the vibe. And it will come into play if they marry someone, or somebody dies, or when they're trying to determine what customary duties their, serfs have to them. Yeah. Right? It's like, what do the serfs owe you? That's when this stuff is going to kind of like come into play. Yeah. And so that's also kind of part of it. We have to also understand that like part of what makes borders necessary and part of what makes borders enforceable is like the mechanism of the state.
Yeah.
And there isn't a state, right?
And there especially isn't a militarized state at this point.
Yeah. So it's like, why, like what would be the point of like stopping people coming through? It's like, the people be like, oh, you mean armies?
Yeah.
Like, it's like, what do you mean stop people from coming through? Well, it's like, well, if there's armies that are coming through, well, then we're in a war, and I guess we're going to have to get an army out. Hey, everyone come get in the city, or everyone come get in the fortress, or whatever. Like, you don't, even then, the way that you think about warfare isn't like, oh, we're going to stop people from coming in. They'll be like, well, if they want to come in, there's no real stopping them. Everyone get in here, like, so the borders in terms of like safety, or the borders in terms of like making military calls are really actual physical walls, physical walls, right? Yeah. So,
Yeah, I mean, and like, just listening to what Eleanor was talking about there, like I think about like all the different stuff with the Holy Roman Empire we've talked about that's just within it. Like, you got there's the 7 electoral districts. There's 10 circles. There are, various like groups and blocks of people. The Hanseatic League, it's just like, yeah, in this part of the Holy Roman Empire and also stuff kind of outside of it, we just free trade here. It's more of a free trade thing, and the borders are even loose, and it's just like that applied there, like on those things along the North Sea, but it didn't apply in like I don't know, Lombardy or somewhere like that. It's just like, they just have so many of these things, and they weren't like, oh well, we're gonna have to show passports to walk through the like heavily armed border between Dusseldorf and wherever.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, like, and you're completely on to something there too, right? Because it's like there's the passport thing, right, which is in Europe, the first state to start enforcing borders and asking for passports is actually France in the early modern period. But it takes that long. Like, it takes getting to the early modern period until anyone asks about these things. And, this is very much a kind of like, it's a function of like, the Enlightenment in their case. And they're like, all these the rational ways that we would put together, l'État, and things like this, and ask for a passport. Now, that isn't true of everywhere in the world. Passports, like Genghis Khan invented passports. Fun fact. So, so like they're the ones who came up with it. Because they were like, are you allowed here? Can I follow you home and kill everyone if they don't amalgamate into our trade? What's going on?
We got a big empire here.
You want in? You want in? You want in? You want in?
No? Okay.
No? Okay, I'll kill you.
How about now? You like horse archers? Yep, cool.
Yeah. Yeah, and so, like, there isn't this kind of, like, desire to necessarily, like, see who belongs where, because, at places like pinch points, right? That is going to be, like, where you have a border more than anywhere else. So, your passes, your bridges, your narrow parts of river, blah, 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 blah.
That's how the Habsburgs got their start. They used trading pinch points in the Alps. The Swiss Alps. Sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry,
you're exactly right. Yeah, it's like, and then they would just shake people down, right? So with this, like you would, in theory, if you're from there, use it as like I'm coming back in and I'm supposed to live here. They'd be like, yeah, cool, we're taxing you too, right? Like, it doesn't, they don't care. They don't care about like, everyone who goes through that is going to have to like pay some form of toll, unless it's like, they're like, oh, that's just Hans. Oh, hey, Hans, and Hans probably pays them off already. So what exists there then is like a network of kinship or a network of civil obligation. Which means that you don't need any kind of like paperwork. So the fact that there are fewer people means that there are also like more relationships in between the individuals that you would be expecting to kind of like borderize, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
And, the medieval people don't really want to stop people coming through. Medieval people want you to come through. They're like, please come through. I'm begging you. Do you have any goods?
And then I'm going to side-eye you the whole time and think you're mysterious and weird for being from a place that's literally a mile and a half down the road. But still, please come visit. I need a chicken or whatever.
Yeah, whatever. It's like, what you got in there? You got beads? Beads? Yep. You got any beads? That's what they want. And they want to tax you, so they want you to come through. The only time they don't really want you to come through is at a time of pandemic. So it's like when the Black Death is coming through, they're like, don't you fucking come in here. Like,
they're like, no,
absolutely not. So it's like, they are really quite interested in trade routes, people who are moving through, because they understand that this also means kind of like money and it means goods. So for them, there just isn't this same idea of like quote unquote protection, right? Now that might then fall away if you're in something like a city, right? Where sometimes cities want something of you if you come to live there.
Right.
And so, for example, and usually what cities mean by that is they're like, you're not going to infringe on any of like the extant guilds, are you? Or are you going to be able to support yourself? Or are you just going to be like begging on the streets kind of a deal? And so a lot of the time, especially with, for example, single young ladies, what will happen with that is they'll be like, where are you going? And you have to then like very, very quickly be made a part of a household, or you might be asked to leave, and they will come check in on that. But when I say be made a part of a household, they're like, you better go be someone's scullery maid.
Yeah.
Right quick, which is not a hard thing to do.
Right.
So, like they basically what they mean is like find gainful employment, because gainful employment usually comes along with lodging. And so there's kind of like something about, the same kind of economic worries that we have now, but it's on a much more molecular level. So it's on a much more kind of like individualized basis, instead of this understanding that there's going to be like massive hordes of people. And like we certainly see this to be the case. So for example, among the poor of Paris, there's quite a few immigrants, right? Like there are English people all fucking over medieval Paris. And they're quite poor, because like if you want bright lights, big city, well, it's Paris, and everybody in England speaks French, right? So they go down there all the time, and then they're like, ugh, I hate being a washerwoman, and this kind of thing. So there is this same kind of expectation that quote unquote immigrants or foreigners very well may end up being poorer. But, at the same time, if you were kind of like a wealthy trader, like if you're a wealthy trader from the lowlands in England, everyone is like, hot diggity damn. Like, would you like a townhouse, sir? And, so you buying wool? Wool? Is this about wool? You going to buy wool? Right? So it's, yeah, it really depends.
Yeah. And I mean, this also comes up in like another thing we've discussed a little bit. And that is like, if you have the means and the know-how, or even sometimes if you don't, and you're just like, I want to go live with some other people in a weird woods commune thing, you could do that in a lot of places, as long as it was unpopulated and there was like no lord was coming out to like stake a claim. The Cathars, or good men and women of Languedoc, they went to live in the woods. The Bogomils did the same thing. It's like you could do that if you go and try and live in the woods right now, unless you're like in an extremely unpopulated area. You're you're going to get kicked off and yelled at and put in jail, maybe. Like
yeah, like totally. In Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, everyone's favorite Robin Hood movie. Right?
Yep.
There's the whole thing about like how they're all like living in their weird little hokey village in the woods. But like that is theoretically possible. In some places not, because sometimes the woods, they'll be like, the king will be like, well, that's where I go to ponce around after deer. Poor people doing here. But a lot of the time there might just be so much woods that, like, again, because there's no such thing as cops, there are no such thing as borders, really. Like you can, like if you are, provided you're not the kind of serf who has people really breathing down your neck, you can just kind of be like, meep. And go live in weird places. And we see this kind of happen, all the time. Like, so for example, say you are part of kind of an oppressed religious minority, like, in the early 14th century in southern Bohemia, you have suddenly like a lot of Waldensians show up. Yeah. Where they're like, because they are all getting like killed in the German speaking land. So they're kind of like, I'm in South Bohemia now. And everyone's like, how do all these Waldensians get in here? And then there's some pushback against that. But it is kind of like you could just kind of like move on. And especially if you're going to places that are a little bit more sparsely populated, you could totally do that. And like, that's what happens in like the 12th century and the big expansion that we have into like the lowlands and places like that once they drain them. You just have whole flocks of people who just show up and they're like, I live in the swamp now. Thank you. Yeah. Right?
Yeah. Crannigman. And so, the last thing here on borders, we got a question. It actually came in today, rather fortuitously, from one of our patrons, Gaffsey. And, it's kind of about the limitations, that did still occur at the relatively porous medieval borders. So, Gavsey says it's sort of a cliche that in zones of contact between societies with largely Islamic elites and largely or significantly mixed Catholic populations, for example, Andalusia, vice versa for Outremer or both Sicily, you end up with a hybrid or syncretic cultures. Could you talk about what that actually meant? Was there a general pattern to how these influences played out, or was it mostly independent, or was it mostly dependent on local conditions and context? How was the material and intellectual culture affected? So, like, yeah, how did, like, if you go between two places, you know, whether they're Muslim and Christian or Christian and Christian or whatever, you know, like what are the things that you run into there that might be problematic? They might not keep you out, but they might be pose issues.
Yeah. So one of the big things that kind of happens a lot of time when you have these kind of like big push points for varying cultures is that a lot of the time what ends up happening is that people kind of like end up falling down on like the Muslim side of things and like doing more Muslim-y things. So these will be things like, you know, for example, like your art might reflect more Islamic themes than Christian ones. So, for example, you might avoid, for example, doing pictures of individuals, and instead you might like aim towards doing like the horror vacui kind of style of art, you know, where you have lots of cool images and things. It's not always true. Like, of course, the differentiation would be in that, like, so say, for example, if you go to the cathedral in Palermo, you got like lots of cool religious, you know, pictures of like, I don't know, mosaic Adams and Eves and things like that from the period. But, you know, by the time that you're in a cathedral, well, you're in the cathedral, so hey, you know, like that's absolutely fine. You also see weird shit happen. So, for example, in Cordoba, when the Catholic, the Christians eventually take over from the Muslim rulers, they're just like, you see that mosque? It's a cathedral now. And then they just like they basically just like punch an altar into the middle of this mosque. Yeah. They're like, you see that? It's Christian, and you're like, okay. And so like they maintain like every single thing about it, right? Like they just add things in on top. And, you know, this is the very medieval thing where it's like, so they maintain the things, but then they just add the gloss of whatever it is going to be on top. So one of the interesting kind of like points within this, though, ends up being food. Because it'll be like, well, how do you fall down on varying lines in terms of what it is you eat? And so this especially will be like a thing about pigs, right? And now in the Outremer, that's less of a question because it's like raising pigs over in, you know, the Levant is kind of more difficult. It's quite hot. You know, they're kind of like, are you going to be raising pigs anyway? It's way easier to run a ton of goats or sheep through there than it is pigs. So again, they just kind of like end up having a little bit more of a cuisine that reflects kind of like the what it is that you've got around the joint. Whereas, for example, on the Iberian Peninsula, the use of pig in food back and forth like is like a real battle. And kind of like what you do there. Now, having said that, also on the Iberian Peninsula, in terms of hybrid culture, what's quite interesting is that you do see like elites take over and things like that, but we have a really great record of what this means in terms of intellectual life, wherein people really maintain their own kind of theological and philosophical ideals. And we see a very lively polemic culture there as a result of this. So we've got letters back and forth between, you know, rabbis and imams and priests where they're all just like having like very fun like three-way arguments where they yell at each other about like finer theological points, and they all call each other like Habibi and shit. Like they're all like, you know, oh, my good friend, you're, you know, like, may you change your mind? And then they'll argue about theology for ages. And we've got these things written down. So we know that these cultures kind of like, they've got their own hybrid thing where they will have customs and foods and stuff like that, where you could say, okay, yeah, that's certainly Iberian, that's certainly Levantine, but you still retain as an individual within it your own kind of like religious culture and practices on top of that. And we know this because of the way they write about themselves and think about themselves. So yeah, it's interesting because it's really quite modern. Right? Well, there'd be the kind of like superstructure of the local culture, which might come out in dress. So a lot of the time they'll end up like dressing like each other. Because it's like, it's hot here. This seems like a nice way to, like, we all have, like, we've got, like, a cool bathhouse that's got, like, 4 different rooms instead of just, like, the one hot bath that, like, is more normal, for example, in, like, Northern Europe, right? So it'll be, like, little things like that with practice. But then your own kind of religious stuff will be its own thing.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So yeah, that is a lot on borders, but I think it's pretty important to look at just how different they are than today, and that moves us kind of into the other part of this, which is dynastic rulership. There are of course some notable exceptions. Modern national political entities are relatively static, and their entire structure won't typically break down when the current ruler dies in office or is voted out. Comparatively, medieval ruling dynasties change constantly, taking their manorial relationships with them for everything from marriages to deaths of rulers, without heirs, to regency arrangements, to just plain old wars and conquest. Can you explain how dynastic marriages and alliances and like the overlapping structure of medieval life led to extremely unstable governing structures?
Yeah, so a really good example of this would be what we've come to now call the Angevin Empire, right? So basically when Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine hooked up, right? So that means they control nominally, like they control England, they control Aquitaine, they control parts of Normandy, they control that guy over there. They've got that, sometimes they control bits of Ireland. They control all of these little and varying places, right? And it's a huge amount of land. Like absolutely enormous. So it's like, all of England plus this plus that, and like maybe like a third of France, something like that. And that also kind of reflects the complexities of borders more generally, because it's like, okay, well, yeah, the Angevins control this, but is this Eleanor's land or is this Henry's land? And they'll be like, oh, actually, we gave that to John because we felt bad for him. Because John didn't have anything. So now this 11-year-old owns this. And you're like, what? So like when you've got a bunch of kids like they do, sometimes you're also just kind of like passing out various parcels going, oh yeah, I guess that no one is going to marry him if that's all he has. Okay, hold on. Does anyone have anything we can give to Richard? And so there will be this kind of like moving around of all these parts. And then also what ends up happening is when all these kids fucking die, then they lose huge bits as well. So, the whole kind of like basis for the 100 Years' War, it's like, okay, like the English sort of want to get their hands on the French crown, but really they're like, no, like, please don't tax me this much over Aquitaine, which we still retain for some reason. But all other huge bits have kind of like fallen by the wayside, and they're too difficult to maintain. And so when John, who is kind of like a so-so king, who's got handed like a really complex bundle of issues when he suddenly becomes king, when he wasn't even supposed to be, right? Like he can't maintain all of that, and he fumbles the bag. So part of what was happening there is that all of these different places are being portioned out to your kids. But then when they all die, it's actually hard for one kid to hold on to it because one person was never holding all, like Eleanor had some of it, Henry had some of it, the young Henry had more, so there's these sort of like competing structures are one of the like the real issues. And, then again, they also had a bunch of daughters. So what's their dower land? Right? What are they taking into marriages? And so you got to peel that off for her and then, this for her. And you end up kind of like rolling back things that then get brought in there. So it's incredibly complex. And granted, this is, the Angevin Empire is a huge outlier. Most people don't control that much land, but it just kind of shows you why people usually don't control that much land, because you're going to have kids. You're going to have to send these things somewhere, right? So they build up this huge amount of land that they control and then lose it really quickly, like within a generation. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So like what example? What examples do we have of just wild swings in rulership over short periods of time?
So, gosh, there's so many, but I decided to kind of talk about Iberia with
Okay.
this when I was sitting here, right? So, um, and two distinct periods is that I want to kind of like shout out here. So one is kind of like what happens in the 8th century when the Umayyad Caliphate comes calling, right? So in the 8th century, the Visigoths control all of the Iberian Peninsula. Like, ta-da, I don't know, we're just Visigothing it up. You like that? Way. And then the Umayyads show up and it's like, bang. Like, it's like the whole thing is just like, we're done, right? Except for Asturias, which Asturias kind of like exists up in the northeastern bit. So kind of like around like Santiago and stuff like that, right? Like so like up around there, that you've got your Asturias, and then Asturias kind of like slowly like moves south and is like I got a little bit more. Ooh, like they kind of end up controlling that bit of Spain that juts out over Portugal and then like into kind of like, I don't know, midway along the Pyrenees at some point in time. Then in 760, the Umayyads become the Caliphate of Cordoba, right? So it's just oops, nope, never mind about that. And then in the 790s, the area about like what is kind of like now Barcelona, it like becomes Spanish Murcia, which is kind of Frankish. And then like 30 years later in 826, suddenly Navarre exists. It kind of like pops up in between Asturias and Murcia. And Murcia then becomes the Spanish March because the Franks kind of like changed the things. Then like 100 years later, in 928, Asturias turns into Galicia. And then there is also like a bit called Leon. And then in the 930s, that remerges into Leon, Galicia, and then Castile forms in the middle of that, right? So like you just have like all these little bits where it's like where it's like someone got married, then they got in a fight. I'm fighting with my dad, right? Then kind of like around about in the 11th century, you hit what we call the Taifa state period, and so like it's like around about the year 1000. Maybe like 1009, you have kind of like the caliphate down in the southern bit, like the Caliphate of Cordoba. But then by 1012, it's like, you have Valencia, Toledo, Almira, Murcia, Denia. Like, you suddenly have all these other things where it's like, oh, word? Okay. Yeah. And then by 1016, you have like a big change, and then Badajoz shows up, like over on the East Coast. Suddenly Granada exists. There's like, okay. And then there's Arcos. And it's like, this happens in like 7 years. And it's like, yeah, no, you're not that anymore. No, now suddenly there's like 8 states. It's like, and this is like before we get into kind of like, the fighting back and forth between, anybody who's like trying to represent Christianity or be particularly some kind of like bulwark of like, I don't know, Islam. So these things are in constant flux, and some of it can just be about you pissed someone off. Sometimes people move back and forth and change their allegiances all the time, and they'll be like, no, I just he's offering me a bigger deal over there, or like a better cut of the pie. And so you're like, yeah, okay, well, now that border goes here. It doesn't necessarily have to be about war. It could be about marriage. It could be about like you just fell out with that guy, which kind of turns into war. But like, I don't mean conquest, I suppose. Like when I say war, I don't mean, we have this tendency to think that like, if wars happen now, then it's happening as a part of kind of conquest and a part of like a pushing of a frontier, but that's not how it works in the medieval period, right? And these things can change very, very fast, because if what you have is a series of interdependent political entities that are kind of like ruled by families, well, what does that mean? Like, stuff can change with families all the time, right? So yeah.
Why was it, from a materialist perspective, why was it that the medieval political forms outside of China, for the most part, why is it that the medieval political forms, especially Afro-Eurasian ones, why couldn't they why were they stuck with this, very personal type of rule like that was based on all these interlocking relationships and stuff? Why were they not able to move past that at the time?
Well, I suppose that from their standpoint, they don't need to, because the rich people are like, well, I got mine and I'm the one who controls everything around here, so fuck it. Right? So it's kind of like about, well, what, the things that are really moving this from a materialist standpoint are oftentimes the needs and desires of the rich and the wealthy, right? Who control kind of like almost all of the violence, right? At the time. And so if they see their needs being met, then they're not going to try to overthrow the structure. And indeed, what they see as being possible within this structure is the possibility to kind of like push these borders out, right? Like make the right alliance, make the correct marriage, do well enough in the war, get rewarded in a particular way, grease the right palm. All of these things could end up benefiting you if you're good at statecraft, right? So there is almost, interestingly, a more individualistic outlook on the part of these people, even in a time that we don't consider necessarily individualistic. But by that, I suppose I mean that they're more tied to kind of like familial pressures. And it's to a certain extent, this is a way that people like to organize themselves into familial structures. Like if we consider families kind of like extended, not the nuclear family unit, but the extended family one, that's a way of kind of like knowing that you have relationships with people and feeling as though there are kind of dual connections in both ways. You don't want to piss your family off, right? You don't want to screw over your uncle in the same way that you might not care about screwing over like that guy over there, right? Because there are religious reasons behind that for medieval Europeans of all stripes, but also just kind of like social implications for that as well. So it's an organizing precept for them as a society, as families, and these kind of like mutual obligations. And provided the rich people are making enough money, they don't really see a reason to rock the boat there.
Yep. Totally, yeah. And then there's this the funny thing about the Holy Roman Empire, when you talk about nationalism in the Middle Ages, is that due to its weird structure, it kind of prevented proto-nationalist stuff from cropping up. To an extent, because Germany wasn't a thing until much later. Italy wasn't a thing until much later. The Czech lands and everything like that. But then, after the medieval period, after the 30 Years' War and everything like that, the HRE then like flips the switch and births like Prussian nationalism, German, Italian, the Netherlands to an extent, Czechoslovakia, and it's just like, so like how did the HREs just like as this entity prevent nationalism from forming, but then like the switch flips and they're all just like, fuck this, we want out.
Yeah, I think that like the big kind of switch there is modernity. Right?
Yeah.
So it's like you just start thinking about things in really different ways. And when you then do introduce hard borders, right? When you do introduce the concept of like, nope, you've walked over the imaginary line, and now that means I need to see your fucking papers. And you need to explain what it is you're doing here. And also there are now kind of like attendant rights that work both ways, where it's like, you owe taxes to a state, which is also kind of like, pressing particular violent obligations on you. Then suddenly you're like, excuse me, what? And you begin casting around for other affinities. So you don't want like a large empire kind of breathing down your neck when it's about like, there is paperwork and I'm going to tell you what you have to do. The large empire kind of overseeing you, and it just mostly being like, oh, I don't know, this is the legal structure that we use, but really it's just like me and my guys in I don't know, Bremen. Like that's that's one thing. It's another thing if, like, with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they're like, okay, oh, you're Czech and you want to make, like, an appeal before the emperor. You have to put on what the emperor considers to be traditional, quote unquote, Czechoslovakian clothes and come down to Vienna in them and pounce about in front of the court like, the silly backwater buffoon you are, right? Suddenly you're like, why the fuck am I in Vienna right now? Why am I dressed like this? Like, who is this display for? And if I'm going to be treated like this by my imperial overlords, like as an other, then I want to hang out with the others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. There's in C.V. Wedgwood's book about the 30 Years' War, she has a really good section kind of about how, like, when the 30 Years' War started, they were all in on, it was a religious thing, like, are you Lutheran or are you Catholic or are you whatever? And then by the end, like, the mercenaries were so mixed and the armies had changed composition so much that it was stopped being like, okay, we got a Catholic army over here and a Lutheran one over here, and they were all mishmashed and hodgepodge together. And now it was more like, okay, instead of yelling, for the Virgin Mary or for whatever, they would be like for Spain or and it, like, so, like, that is, I think, a good anecdotal thing is, like, they got to this point and then, like, the pressures of modernity and just the horrors of the 30 Years' War, and they were like, yeah, you know what, fuck it, there's so many Lutherans all over everywhere, and we're not universally Catholic anymore, so fuck it. Like, as you said, we got to flail around for another identity, and, you get the national identity.
Yeah.
Are we German? Are we Czech? Do we hate the Germans? Do we hate the Italian?
Yeah. Completely.
Yeah. And yeah, the last thing we're going to talk about today, just real quick, a very long time ago, actually, I think we're getting close to the 2-year anniversary of the show here. And this is actually also, I think, going to be the 150th episode. So yeah, woo! Pop, party poppers and everything like that. Woo! A long time ago, we did a series on China, and it's actually really good. We did a little bit of history, but mostly focusing on China in the Middle Ages. And one thing we talked about there is that, aside from the fact that they invent everything earlier than everyone else for like 3,000 years, it's really different. Like, China has had a cohesive empire since like 221 BCE, which is right about the time they got rid of their feudal social order. And they have been kind of obsessed with their borders to a greater or lesser extent since then, and actually expanded to their current borders, except for a small chunk of northwestern China, around 1300 CE. And in addition to that, they have the Mandate of Heaven, which means the ruling dynasty can change, but the borders usually don't, though. There's warring states and all that sort of warring states periods and all that sort of stuff, and the imperial government remains mostly unchanged, except for some new people come in. So, like, can you talk a little bit about the concept of like inner and outer China, and then how, despite all of this, it's still not nationalism as we understand it now?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it nationalism. I'd call it imperialism. Just straight up.
Cool.
And I think that's like the easiest thing to do with it. And the reason,
that makes sense.
Yeah. And like the reason we can do that, like, I mean, don't get me wrong, there is some kind of like pushback, right? So say, for example, anytime the Mongols managed to take over, right?
Yeah.
Like,
they're like, whoa.
Hey.
I don't know what you guys thought you were doing up there, but here in China,
yeah. They'll be like, and they'll be like this big thing. And like sometimes the Mongols have to be like, well, that's it, we're cleaning house. And like, and actually, well, I got to show you how
to end up with Kublai Khan.
Yeah, exactly. That's how you end up with Kublai Khan. And there's like this famous thing that is said, which is that like China can be conquered from a horse, but not ruled from one, right?
Yeah.
Which is, and that means that you need to take over the state bureaucracy which exists. And so they have borders because they have a bureaucracy and a state which maintains those borders. And they have like all of the bureaucratic functions that we would expect to see from an early modern state, right? And they simply do. And that is a fact, right? And there's a reason why Genghis Khan is the one who comes up with passports, right? And then they're all like, oh, actually, that's a pretty good idea.
Wait, somebody else invented something first? Fuck,
Damn,
we got to take that shit.
Right, so, they like that shit. But the inner and outer China, in many ways, kind of acts as, in the same way that you could think of over in medieval Europe, like the city versus the lands that the city owns, right? So inner China will be like, they're like, this is where the Han Chinese are. This is where
the real
wink. But outer Chinese things, it's like, I don't know, but on the other hand, this sure is good to exploit for resources, right? And so we can exploit this for taxation purposes. We can exploit it for resources and goods. But, the inner China, which is more highly urbanized, usually, that's usually where you're going to draw people from into the bureaucratic system. So the people who are going to be taking the state exams in order to become bureaucrats, they're usually going to be more drawn from inner China. That'll be one thing. And outer China is usually more what they kind of see as they're kind of like colonies. It's not, colonies isn't the right word. Because they're like, they're not going over there to colonize them. They're just like,
they're still administered.
Yeah, exactly. Like from in the same way. But it just means they kind of care a little bit less about governance, I guess. And there is like a kind of nationalism at work here. There is a kind of understanding about like Chineseness, which means like Han-ness within these cases. And there is, of course, like also this understanding of like other people as barbarians and, like the cooked or uncooked barbarians, as we talked about in our China episodes. But basically, this ends up making a kind of buffer zone between what they see as like the real barbarians on the outer edge of that. Their words, not mine. To be clear.
Yeah.
I don't see non-Han Chinese people as barbarians.
Wow, that would be a weird thing to hold on to. I'm sure some people do, but that'd be an insane thing to hold on to.
Yeah.
You guys have been mixing up for 2,000 years. Time to let it go, man. China is just like when you have that state bureaucracy that they have, it's not always the most efficient thing, and it's not always, it's definitely leads to a lot of corruption and things like that. But at the same time, like easily the most advanced political form in the world.
Oh, God, yeah.
Almost like until 14, 15, 1600, something like that. Like, it's, it's, China. They invented everything earlier, including the state. But it's, just kind of wanted to talk about that because it is definitely something to look at because, usually when we're talking about Europe and, the Middle East a little bit and everything like that. But, China has its own different Middle Ages, although not entirely different and not, they didn't jump to modernity, in like 1200 or anything, but it's still different. It's different when you have like a whole state apparatus and everything like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Much like how Europe and Africa and the Middle East were different when they had the Roman state bureaucracy.
Quite.
in the classical era. But so that's going to do it for proto-nationalism in the Middle Ages. We have a bonus episode coming at the end of the week, and we'll be back next time with some more, probably more stuff on proto-nationalism, maybe an interview, and also the second episode or the third episode in our series on Andor. But Eleanor, what do you got going on these days?
That's a great question. Always and forever go on, check over at the blog going-medieval.com. Probably won't have time to write anything this week, but I'm cooking something up about death rates of the Black Death in Asia and Africa and what that can tell us. And mostly in response to myths about how like only Europeans died of it because they didn't bathe. Anyway, like I'll kill everyone, much like the Black Death. Whoa, whoa. But you can find me on the socials at Going Medieval. I guess my Instagram isn't Going Medieval though. It's Dr. Eleanor Yanaga. So if you want to I don't know. I put pictures on there. I don't fucking know, dude. I don't know what I'm doing. You can also, believe it's the 17th. I believe my paperback of The Once and Future Sex is now available in America. So if you haven't got your hands on it yet and you're an American, please do that. And otherwise, yeah, I don't know. Just think of me fondly.
Yeah. Yeah, you can find me usual, I'm on the socials. Luke is amazing. You can find my old show, People's History of the Old Republic, wherever you're listening to this. But yeah, that's going to do it for us for today. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.